This is an S-curve. Everybody come across S-curves? Again, it's basically a theory of how things come in. So what I've done here is I've combined it with Moore's Crossing the Chasm. Anybody read that? Okay, Moore's Crossing the Chasm is probably the best book on IT marketing I know, so I strongly recommend it. So I've combined the two. Basically, the idea is when a new idea comes into play, the early adopters get very, very excited. And nobody minds this because all companies want to have a space where people have novel ideas. It's kind of like considered good form. Yeah, they're always put behind barriers somewhere safe and not allowed to talk with anybody. We used to have a phrase in IBM, oh, it's performing seal time again, is it? Because what would happen is, they'd sell an outsourcing contract, they put in the cost reduction guys, and they'd want somebody from research to come and excite the clients. But they'd excite the client about your latest idea, but then they'd send you back to research because you were disturbing the environment, yeah? We used to say that was performing seal time. Came around every year on the annual appraisals. What then happens is the idea becomes serious, and at that point, the white blood cells kick in. This is the cardinal Bedamimi moment, and it's not deliberate. It's taken me years to realize this, but as I keep trying to tell my children, wisdom comes with age, but for some reason they don't understand that. I can't really realize why. But basically, people aren't killing you because they don't like you. It's just an allergic reaction of the system to something too different. And of course, some ideas survive that, and they become the new orthodoxy. Often compromised in the process. That's what actually happened with systems dynamics. It got fatally compromised, and by its early adopters. And then basically it gets taken to excess, it loses utility, but actually that's where the next new idea comes in. And now you see the reason for the overlap? Yeah, it's only when the new idea is finally coming to the end of its lifespan, there's space for a new idea. But of course it dominates, so it suppresses it some more. And the key thing to understand is if you don't change then, you don't survive. The British IT industry went under in the 80s because it didn't understand that the world had changed. And I could go through hundreds of other examples. And that allows me to look at the pattern of management science over the years. We have scientific management from the turn of the last century to the 1980s, sometimes known as Taylorism. Big new idea, management is a science. Big new technology, the telephone. It's actually quite interesting. If you look at the history of human change, it's communication technologies which trigger the biggest change. Because, of course, they connect people in different ways. The Renaissance wouldn't have been possible if it hadn't been for stealing how to create cheap paper from the Chinese. It wasn't the printing press, it was cheap paper. And that allowed us to communicate through the printed word. The telephone transformed industry from you owned a ship, you owned a factory, to you owned an international business. Yeah, and then we get Taylor and everything which comes with that. These guys took a military model because it was the only model available about how to manage large groups of people. The trouble is they took the peacetime military model, they didn't take the wartime military model. I do a lot of work in military environments. In wartime, everything changes. The hierarchy is dissolved. But of course that wasn't done. But don't knock it, it worked very well into the 1980s. Oh, and incidentally, the other thing, 1920s, recession. You should start to see a pattern there. New idea, new communication technology, recession. It's like a perfect storm. When they come together, it allows something to happen. 1980s, we get systems dynamics. Yeah, systems thinking starts to come through here with Forrester, Stafford Beer, and other people. It gets popularized by people like Senge. But fundamentally, what it focuses on is outcome. The principle here is you define a future state. This is where we get 3-year plans and 5-year plans for Porter, Hammer and Chamfrey, re-engineering the corporation, Kaplan and Norton, the balanced scorecard. The assumption is the organization is a machine which can be engineered. That's the big idea which comes in on the 80s. One of the big problems with the 1980s to the current day is people have tried to replace humans with information technology. Yeah, and that's kind of like the fetishistic period, we're moving out of that. And the big new idea is complexity. Now, a couple of big differences. What you see with the systems dynamics guys is they want to define outcomes. Senge wants to define common values. The way you manage a system is you define what values people have. In fact, Fifth Discipline is a very scary book. Because it says everybody should assume their individual attitudes in the greater good of the corporation. And of course, what the greater good of the corporation is determined by the executives. Yet, fortunately, it never happened because it would destroy genetic variety. You need people who think differently because it creates the variety. Big difference between efficiency and effectiveness. A system which hasn't got a degree of inefficiency in it will never be effective because it loses adaptive capacity. We've over-focused on efficiency at the expense of effectiveness. Yeah, so big differences on that. A couple more things to finish off on. I just want to create, I'll go through this quite quickly because I'm coming to the end of the period. All familiar with this little beastie? Everybody assesses risk based on these. Yeah, so the idea is that if something is here, it's so improbable you don't have to take account of it. Sound familiar? Okay, that's all very well when you're tossing coins. There's another thing called a Pareto distribution. This is earthquakes, otherwise known as a power law. If I do a double log scale of size against frequency of any natural phenomenon, I get one of these beasties. And if I draw that on this, the curve looks like that. It has a fat tail. So something that I can dispense with is so improbable I don't have to worry about it. Turns out to actually have quite a high probability if I use a Pareto distribution rather than a Gaussian one. And guess what? Gaussian distributions don't appear in nature. Pareto distributions do. This is called the New Orleans levees problem. Because people assess the risk based on a Gaussian distribution, actually it's Pareto. Now one of the big consequences of this is a shift from strategies based on robustness to strategies based on resilience. If the world is such that you can't avoid failure, what matters is early detection, fast recovery. And strategically, that's even more important because it allows you to spot opportunities faster. If you architect on the assumption of tolerable failure, you will be in a much better place. My favourite example is if you go up the river to Gloucester, people built houses a few years ago on glebes and watermeadows. It sounded terribly romantic in the estate agents' literature. And then over the last few years, they've discovered why they're called watermeadows. And when the government withdrew the insurance levy, they're about to become uninsurable. Now, if you look at the way houses were built in the 18th century, they have stone flag floors, no plaster, and hooks in the beams. Because they know you don't want a damp-proof course, because what matters is water draining away quickly. The hooks in the beams are so you put ropes around your furniture and hook them on the beams. So the water goes through, you're okay again almost straight away. People are now rebuilding in the floodplains on the same principle. Good soil science, no plaster on the walls, electric cables which go up to the top and come down, and hooks with electronic pulleys because we don't know our neighbours well enough these days to hike your furniture up. And increasing the door sill size. And what you're doing is you're doing your best to prevent failure, but you're assuming every now and then there will be a failure. So you're architecting on the basis of tolerated failure. Now, every civil engineer I've ever known, I've worked with a lot, has always done that anyway. And the trouble is, the sponsors want them to define systems which will never fail. And that's dangerous. So this concept of building strategies based on resilience rather than robustness is one of the really big things coming through at the moment. And again, that fits in with the safe fail. And that sort of explains it in more detail. So what you basically got at the top, in Gaussian, what you've got is many to many. You've got many outcomes, many inputs, so stats works. The trouble is, when you get into low frequency, high impact events, you've got lots of input, a small number of outcomes, like terrorism. So you haven't got a normal statistical prediction route. So whereas we use deductive logic or induction, deduction is if A then B. Induction is I've got lots of A's, all of which have B's in them, therefore A is associated with B. Big danger on induction is confusing correlation with causation, something which is endemic in management science. The fact that 50 successful companies have managing directors who play golf doesn't mean if your managing director plays golf, you will be successful. But every article in the Harvard Business Review, with the exception of one in November 2007, actually makes that assumption. A lot of the complexity guys, incidentally, are confusing simulation with prediction. The fact your model can simulate historical reality doesn't mean it can predict the future. But you can simulate birds flying around in the sky, but whether they go to the left or right of the mountain, you can't predict. Has major consequences. What we do down here is called abduction. Abduction is making connections between things which are apparently unconnected. It's about plausible routes, not probable routes. And of course, this is what human beings do naturally. We're very geared up towards serendipity. The trouble is, it suffers from a logical error. For those of you who haven't done logic, post hoc ergo sumpter prop. The fact that I can make this association and you can make a contradictory association, how do we prove which is which? The way you handle that is by huge volumes of human agents making a decision. Because that way I can create objectivity in an abductive form, which is key to innovation and weak signal detection. And just to show you an example of that, ignore that one. This is called a fitness landscape, and this is my final slide. That has got 17,000 micro-narratives in it. We did this project in Iran. We sponsored a university who sponsored a university, so this project was entirely done by Iranian citizens asking stories about culture in Iran with no mention of the West. The stories were told by people and self-interpreted by the people who told the story. I'll put a link on the website tonight to something which explains that in more detail. But the principle of this is I don't want an expert to tell me what people's stories mean. I want the person who told the story to tell you what it means, but within a framework that I can interpret. Okay? So that model has 17,000 micro-narratives quantitatively interpreted at the point of origin, not qualitatively. So I've got numbers. And the hollows represent belief systems which aren't going to change because they're stable attractor mechanisms. The peaks represent areas where change can happen quickly. Weak signal detection. The depressing thing about that is, however we look at this, we get those two big hollows. One is anti-American, the other is anti-West. We've allowed a nation to define itself by not being us, and we've got to take responsibility for that. Yeah, they're not responsible, we're responsible for that in basic anthropology terms. So if you want to change something, you don't go anywhere near that, because everybody believes something and they'll listen to 2% of what you say, and they'll listen to the 2% which responds to the negative belief. What you want to do is to find an area here and make it deeper. We're now doing this for architects. Sorry to mention architects, I did promise to only do it once, yeah? Where actually we're getting stories from people in a city area about what sort of space they want to live in. We're not asking them about the redevelopment, we're asking them to tell stories about lives that they would want. Very abstract questions. Index into a structure. Then we're getting architectural students to index buildings into the same structure. And then we're mashing the two databases together. Which is actually what a really experienced architect does after 40 or 50 years of life. And start to think about that. You put knowledge bases into customer bases, you move them together, you draw these sort of things. But critically, we kept the model fixed and moved it on 3 months. So the yellow dots represent outliers, things which don't fit. And 3 months on, there are now 28,000 micro-narratives in that picture. Cost of this project was $25,000, by the way. Compare that with traditional market research. And you see that little cluster of 8 stories, bottom right? That's a fear of being seen as barbaric and uncivilized. That's a weak signal. And the point, this is disintermediation. Your eye is drawn to the outliers, not to the dominant patterns. We got this, we've got a US firm, every 250 stores across the States, every 100th customer gets given a drink or a chocolate bar for free if they'll go into a video booth and tell a story about their experience. The marketing director has this on their desk, and they can click on the model and listen to the stories told by their consumers. No market researchers, no mystery shoppers, no interpretive frameworks, but direct access. We did one for the UK government recently, 3,000 micro-narratives in Pakistan in 2 days, including 1,000 from the refugee camps, 9,000 from the UK from inner city areas, interpretation out 24 hours after capture, using children as field ethnographers in a schools program. I wanted to show you that at the end because I wanted to come up with something you can do. It's very easy to criticize, but it's more difficult to come up with it. The world we're now moving into is one in which it is informed by natural science. It's as radical a change in natural science now as 300 or 400 years ago. In fact, what's interesting is the merge between two. The merge between biology and anthropology is fascinating at the moment. We've got huge opportunities to think about the world in a different way. But we can't afford to do that with the idealistic cant of systems dynamics, and I'm being deliberately rude there, but actually it's true. It's all about employ me and we'll do it right. Actually, that doesn't work. You've got to change the system. Yeah? Natural science gives us scalability and a degree of certainty to move forward, but we need to understand how social systems can be augmented and evolve with technology and engineering practice. They're not separate, they're co-evolutionary. Thank you very much for your time.